Data Storytellers. Today, I'm here with Pat McQuillan, who's the Global Head of Effectiveness and Data Governance for Service over at Wayfair. Great to have you with us.
Great to be here, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, likewise. I'm really excited for our conversation today. Just to start with, tell us a little bit about your professional background, your journey to becoming a data leader at Wayfair.
Yeah, absolutely. I come from a background as a professional economist consultant for a number of years. I began work with the UN, doing a development work for them down in New York and Geneva. And then from there, I transitioned into economic consulting, which is a very specific niche of consulting, but very, very data heavy and stats driven. It's basically a group of academics and professionals who are pulled together to provide expert testimony in front of major legal proceedings regarding regulation. So things like preventing certain mergers that would create too much market power, uncovering securities fraud if companies were, maybe doing some insider trading or, had some sort of questionable valuation methods, things like that. And our job is to work through, sometimes, we work through anything from a 100,000 row data set to 200 billion rows, and it was, we were talking terabytes here. And it was really fascinating work. And from there, I went to grad school, got my MBA, and afterwards did some strategy and statistical and analytical consulting for a while. And most recently, before Wayfair, I was a director of strategy and analytics for a media company down in Boston. And that brings me here now to Wayfair. It's been a very exciting journey so far.
Yeah, so been in the role for almost a year now. What are some of the differences you've seen compared to the previous roles you've had?
Yeah, I feel like right now, so this is one of my more, historically, I was, very hands-on engineering for a lot of the work I was doing. And, now just because of the scale of our service offering and, obviously just the amount of, data that we're working with, the scale of Wayfair, there's quite a bit more, I would say, specificity along the roles that are being assigned to folks. So, I don't do too much hands-on engineering work anymore. So it's really more about bringing this sort of conceptual and strategic thinking to the table as somebody who speaks the same language and can sort of speak to the truth of the data. And I feel like that has been a particularly beneficial aspect of this role because as I'm sure you're aware, and from what I've experienced in my career, one of the biggest, I would say, red flags that you want to make sure you can prevent in any sort of working environment is having someone who's very heavily involved in managing and overseeing the data that's being processed within an organization who does not have a data background. You want to make sure they can speak that language. You want to make sure that if it's something simple like just understanding how a basic ETL process works, is maybe something more complicated like different ML models or, bleeding edge AI work that's being done, that they can at least speak to some degree of detail to be able to get more in like that lower level type of thinking that's needed to make sure that these things are successful and not just leading them to sort of the wins and the fates.
And you've had this pretty diverse background in terms of industry as well, also working as a consultant. So you probably work with a number of companies that way as well. How have you seen data analytics progress throughout your tenure working in this field?
Sure. I feel like I've lived 100 years in 10. It's definitely been, it's been interesting to see. I feel like in my opinion, it's the fastest growing industry right now is data analytics, primarily because I feel like there was this recognized need and this sort of suddenly available capacity to perform more advanced analytics at a broader scale that came about in the mid to late 2000s. And that started kind of tying into more data-driven work. I know we all remember 2012, 2013, all of the VC money was going to AI. If anything was automated or artificial intelligence, it was this flashy new thing that I think a lot of more senior folks at the time hadn't really encountered or known too much about. They just knew that it had some very broad and applicable capabilities. And because of that, I think a lot of the people who sort of started the modern data science industry didn't really have a formal training in it. Like a lot of folks, including myself, learned it on the job. There weren't a large plethora of master's degrees that specialized in data science. It was more, you would do statistics or you would do, a PhD in computer science or some sort of engineering, and it would come as a complement to that. But now we're seeing it's such a specific demand that entire departments, entire companies are being run by it. Now, compared to when I started, we're seeing more and more professionals who actually do have specific training in this before they even enter the workforce. And I feel like AI from 10 years ago, which was this nuanced thing, is now suddenly just accepted as business as usual. We've really come a long way in 10 years. And because of that, I feel like, data's, for lack of a better term, data's become sexy again, and I think it's very exciting to see.
Yeah, it's so true. And over the last 10 years, it's changed so much in terms of how, not just how individuals perceive data, I think, but also how organizations perceive data. There's a lot of people, for example, on LinkedIn who, they put out videos and consultants and what have you. And it's really dangerous because it can send the wrong flavor of message to data. It can turn people off data if the message isn't delivered in the right way. And I think you mentioned earlier the language of data and some people get it. And I think you're one of the people who gets it. And I think there's a lot of people who just simply don't get it. And, just pumping content out for the sake of it. And I really want to talk about this whole language of data and how you perceive yourself as a data leader, but I'm sure we'll get into that. Right now, then, you mentioned that there's been this progression over the last 10 years. What do you think are the biggest opportunities for ambitious companies and leaders in data analytics today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that in the past, there's been a very strong push for developing new types of models, new types of innovations. And the thing is, while that's true to a point, I feel like with data, you have to be a little careful, right? Because a lot of the time, unless you have an executive team who's very well versed in data engineering or data science, which sometimes you do, but in a lot of cases they're more built up of a more broad, diverse skill set. Some people have a financial background, strategy background, things like that, and data is always in the periphery, but they can't always speak to that level of depth that's needed. And because of that, a lot of the push that sometimes managers in the field receive from coming down the ladder is more, let's just develop something new and fresh, because that's a typical way of thinking. When you're at a company, we need a more innovative product. We need to iterate on this. We need to iterate on it. But the type of iteration from a data science perspective, it should be more focused around creating sustainability to scale and efficacy. And I think a lot of the time, some folks, particularly if they're a smaller company trying to sort of differentiate themselves, will try to create a new type of model or a new type of analysis or a new type of method, similar to how maybe you want to roll out a new type of automobile or a new type of widget. And the fact of the matter is, a new model doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be as effective as the old existing models, the tried and true. We've been using regressions for almost 100 years now, and regressions are still, they're a jewel in the belt of sort of data science today. And so I feel like right now, there needs to be a push more to make sure these models are trained up properly, to make sure that we're using a method that's focused on efficacy and hitting long-term goals, and a method that we can scale, rather than some complicated, random forest classifier or a neural net that's going to be inherited by another team 5 years from now and just built on, and it suddenly, just deviates from its original purpose. I think, so I think that's an important thing to separate. And I think if I could summarize it in one phrase, it would really just be that the imperative here is that creative and new and flashy, there is a place for it if it works. But the question always has to be, does it work? And does it work at the scale that we need? And is this going to be a short-term win that we're going to have to retroactively correct in 6 months? Or is this something that can actually live on its own and be easily inherited and scaled up that works?
And you mentioned there has to be this, you said there has to be more of a push from the top. So what role do you think that data analytics leaders like heads of function, CDOs play in these big transformations? Are they essentially governing which projects go ahead? Do you think that's the right way to look at it? Or is it that and more?
Yeah, I don't think that they should have a role in direct governance on these projects. I do think that just having some foundational level of data literacy and understanding at least the output that a general product can offer. They don't have to know model by model, but I think they have to realize that, it's not just working magic on a keyboard, that there's, the conversation around, how much of our back-end infrastructure is going to have to be updated? How about the way we, process the raw data, like during our ETL process before it goes into the model? How many models are we pushing it through? How many teams are owning different aspects of this? Maybe it's a machine learning model that ultimately rolls up to, web dev team. And so, how is web dev going to inherit it, and how's that going to change things? And they are aware of that. And I think that's where I'm seeing, a lot of the positive growth with a lot of these companies, like where you have these execs or at least senior leaders who do speak the general language, and they fully understand where that knowledge stops and where they have to pass it to trust on to the individual teams tasked with that work. But a lot of the time, some folks just want to, get a product out. Like you see this in industry where, you look at just large companies and sometimes they'll try to, get something out for the sake of getting it out and not really realize the timeline or appreciate how much, QA or, user testing needs to be done. And, I think just having some level of familiarity at the executive or senior leadership level is extremely beneficial. And then from there, just being able to trust their teams and understand that some level of flexibility has to be incorporated, because data science, as we all know, there aren't really many companies that do strictly data science. It's companies in healthcare and e-commerce and tech that rely on data science as a complementary resource. And I think that has to be understood, that it's going to complement everything we do. So just remember that it's constantly a part of that lifeblood.
Mm. And as the name suggests, I really want to dive into the storytelling and the messaging piece behind this, because you mentioned that the senior leaders, they don't need to be on the ground technical guys, but they do need to have that visibility. So how have you gone about engaging senior leaders with the idea, I guess, of data-drivenness in the past?
Sure. I will say I don't think ever really received pushback on trying to get something to be data-driven throughout my entire career.
Maybe you're just a great storyteller.
I hope so. I mean, apparently it's working out so far, but I will say, and this is a fun anecdote that I can share. I can give you a fun example where I don't think that the matter is so much like getting pushback, because I don't think that really, at least in my experience, has ever happened, but it's more so, I think sometimes maintaining a consistent level of education for particularly the folks who, are partly responsible for what we're doing, but aren't necessarily on the ground doing it. So there are things that we can do that maybe they don't realize. So to give an example, back when I was doing regulatory consulting as an economist, we received like a secure, through a secure server, about 40,000 files that were being provided to us by our client, their legal team. And they said, we need you guys to download all of these, clean them up, process the data. And it was a manual point and click process. And that process, it took us probably 4 or 5 hours to get through 6 or 7 of the documents, just because logging in, clicking this, clicking that, like all of the layers of, security, and then finally downloading it and cleaning it. And we said, there has to be a way to automate this. And so our manager at the time, he didn't think that there was a way. He said, unfortunately, I think he was getting stressed. He goes, I think this is going to take all summer. We're going to have to hire some people to contract or, outsource this and get people to, download this information. Just such a tedious but necessary task. And a guy in our team, I saw him the next morning and he said, hey, so I hopped into Python and I wrote some code and I think I can automate this whole thing. And we can probably get all the data by the end of the week. And I said, oh, wow, you should tell that to our manager. And so we hop on the call with our manager. And he goes, great. So yesterday we got through 1 to 20. He goes, so Pat, today you go through 21 to document 40, and so you can go through file, 41 to 60. And he goes, I'll take 61 to 80, and then we'll just keep going and going. And my friend on the call, he goes, can I take 41 to 40,000? And he goes, what? And he goes, yeah. Because I wrote some code and we'll have it by the end of the week. And we can get the client what they need. There's no delay in the project and we don't have to outsource this. And it saved millions of dollars in billing fees and tech fees. And it was just, he didn't realize that we could even do this. And this is back in like 2015. So this is back when things were a little simpler and we were primarily a SQL and SAS based house. So Python was something he wasn't too familiar with. And I think that level of education is important to see.
And awareness is obviously a huge challenge here. And again, convincing someone to getting that end-to-end narrative behind here's what I can do for you and here's why you should do it is one of those big challenges now as well. What do you think are some of the other key challenges for data transformation leaders today?
Yeah, I'd say some of the biggest challenges are understanding. It's kind of almost going back on something I said earlier. So I know how, consistency and efficacy is definitely the most important. But as I also mentioned, there does still have to be it shouldn't be your priority, but there should be some attention paid to maybe developing a new way of analyzing something. So it shouldn't be your bread and butter. It shouldn't be your, entire foundation for value. But I think as a manager, you have to start thinking about how can we make this analysis more effective? And that means sometimes people think that means making it more technical and more quantitative, but a lot of times it can even mean making it more qualitative. It can mean, I think a lot of teams sometimes will jump into, if you're doing, say, a CX analysis, maybe you are looking at, responses to media and some Google Analytics data, but, maybe some loose surveys, but, maybe there's a brand lift study that you can conduct and you want to just incorporate that to frame the overall discussion. You want to maybe incorporate, like I remember we were working with a client, one of my previous roles where, we noticed a huge dip in spending for some medical services, and they were not life-threatening. So it was sort of the type of thing people would need to opt into. And so we looked at a lot of the in-house data that we'd collected in some surveys, and something was still missing. So I actually suggested we build up an ML model that also took into account societal stressors that could cause anxiety and potentially prevent people from wanting to spend the money for these services that would be required. These were, 5 or 6 figure, expenses that wouldn't necessarily be covered by insurance. So we looked at the vaccination rate from COVID. We looked at interest rates as like a proxy for like affordability and like willingness to spend. We looked at, a few other things that our client had no clue they should be looking at. They were looking at media spend. They were looking at, what are their customers saying? And they weren't looking at the noise happening around everybody, the seas that are rocking the ship. You can have the best ship in the world, but if the water is rough, the water's rough. And so I think having a focus on just new ways of looking at things brings a huge amount of value, because at the end of the day, it doesn't come down to a number. It comes down to being able to bring something to the table and sit around with a bunch of different folks from different teams and different backgrounds, some of whom are not with data at all, and be able to convey a very meaningful insight and frame it well. So a lot of times, while we all want a simple number, sometimes it's a series of charts and figures and trend lines, plus surveys, plus some sort of qualitative feedback, some sort of conversation around like hypothesis that we haven't proven yet, but there's some foundational causality that we need to run with, because we'll never be 100% confident in anything, and if you can hit that 90, 95, if you can even hit 80 and run with that and then do some more discovery, that's good. But I think it's just understanding what your limitations are, knowing that no data science shop whatsoever will ever hit 100%, and just being able to continue to carry that forward while trying to maybe bring in a broader sense of thinking and maybe a broader foundation of information than people normally think to do.
And it's easy to say, and a lot of people say this, and there is credence to it, but I just kind of want to play the devil's advocate on it. I think that, as you were touching on there, sometimes if you speak to a senior leader, they just want a number or, like you said, a series of numbers. But to actually push back on that takes a lot of courage, which I think is a really good attribute to have as a data leader. One thing I really want to get into on this actually is your background is both analytics, which I would say is more business facing, and then now in data governance. So from your experience, how can data management, data governance leaders work to become more business facing?
Yeah, there are a few different ways they can go about it. I've always viewed data governance as the philosophy behind performance management and behind just generally the knowledge base that a company or organization is working with. And so I think data science is a part of it for sure. As is infrastructure management, IT, stats, all the good stuff. But I think on top of that, you really need to bring in every corner of the business and how you think, because I'm not talking to just data science. I'm not talking to just strategists. I'm talking to finance teams. We're working with folks on the ground, working with folks, in the boardroom. We're trying to really, really pull that entire conversation together. And I think the most important thing is to just remember that at the end of the day, it's a logical role. It's not about hitting that number. It's not about showing a specific number and boiling it all down to a single number. It's about being able to have a discussion that everyone can understand at any point in time, and that they understand the business case for why you're saying it. So if you don't have one number, but you have 6 numbers in a report, just make a business case for why. Keep it concise, bring it to the table and explain. But I think as far as having effective data governance and to get to that point, you really, really need to have a full view on what the goals of the business are. You really, really have to have a full view and alignment from everybody on what they want and what outcome they want to achieve, because you are essentially channeling that. You're the vessel. But, I am not a CEO. I'm not the one who sets those goals. So I want to make sure that we can talk with the folks in charge, and that we can also talk to the folks who are generating data, in our case, field agents, or, in someone else's case, looking at, website interactions or customer purchases or whatever a company would be looking at, and really make sure that everyone understands that the ship is working in the way it's supposed to, and then create some foundational logic on how we want to measure its performance and meet those goals and track toward them and share it out. So it is data science, but it's also understanding strategy. It's knowing where the finance folks are coming from. It's knowing what goals we have to hit for shareholders if you're publicly traded. It's knowing, what we can do. Maybe there's a goal to hit this certain thing and it's not realistic and we have to maybe reassess and pivot a little bit. But I think at the end of the day, it really just comes down to remembering that this is essentially the neurology of the business. And you have to understand how each little neuron connects to each other, because you can't really cop out or back out or, take a shortcut or an easy way when it comes to, being responsible for the underlying logic of how we understand how healthy we are.
That's a great analogy to use about the neurology of the business, because I think that a lot of you can frame the business as neuroplastic, right? Neuroplasticity, where there is this interconnected tissue within the business, but that's malleable and it changes with the business needs, customer needs, external factors. And actually, I think neurology plays a huge part in what we're about here. And I think you mentioned about framing conversation, having those chats with senior leaders. Essentially, what you're talking about there is the improvement of soft skills. So how important have these skills been, like communications, influence, persuasion, been throughout your career?
They have been extremely important, Paul. They have been foundational, I think. And I think you brought up a very good point here, right? Where, it's where a lot of people entering the industry, particularly, or folks who want to work their way up in the industry, very, very rarely are you going to be able to get by on your sort of stats and technical skills alone. They're going to get you through early in your career. They could get you through to an internship, an analyst level, a senior analyst, even a manager. But at the end of the day, you need to have good people skills, because unless your entire career you're going to be, running these numbers and then just passing them on, now there's more and more of an increasing call for these business intelligence types of conversations where, maybe it's as simple as a Tableau or Power BI dashboard, or maybe it's as complex as, again, some sort of, very like 11,000 line, code in R that you're trying to put through. And at the end of the day, there's more of this discussion of having the person who built that also present it, especially as you become more senior in your job. And so I think having those soft skills and being able to communicate well to people, being able to share, again, 90% how you say it, right? Only 10% what you say. If you're trying to make a case and you're trying to say all this stuff is going well, but you're not enthusiastic during the conversation, the data's in front of them, but you let the data speak for itself and you don't frame what was done, you don't frame your assumptions, you don't, go in understanding what your audience wants to take away from it, and you just, dump your findings and go back into the room that you're doing your work in. It's not a recipe for long-term success. You need to be able to engage with folks and realize that this is, again, a logical role, that you are doing this analysis, but there's a purpose. And that purpose is to make some sort of a business recommendation, to help decisions be made. And you can pass it along to folks who are responsible for those decisions, but they'll likely want to hear from you because they didn't look at the data. They didn't do the research. And they would want to hear what your voice is on this. And especially as you become more and more senior and you build out a skilled team, the best teams I've ever worked with, both being managed by and managing, are folks who, this is some advice that was given to me a long time ago, who avoid the tyranny of a straight line and who really take the extra time to consider all factors going into this analysis. So that's not just the numbers, but also the emotions, the desires, the timelines, the impacts upstream and downstream, and being able to just say in a clear voice, this is how I understand things are going on. And this is what I think we need to do. And let's go from that. And then you can have a conversation. But the soft skills are absolutely paramount.
Yeah. And it's so funny because this comes up all the time. And actually it went a lot into our logo. So our logo is actually the left and the right brain, right? Where you've got the creative side that has to come in and the soft skills side, but also aligning that with the logical. And there's a really thin line in between that. And then how you actually can execute that is the $1 million question, really. And this is kind of a more open question. What qualities would you use to describe people who have been successful in this? Let's say our adjectives. What would you use to describe some of the more successful ones who engage with these people?
Sure. The most obvious one, which I'm sure will come as no surprise, is curious. Definitely folks who are curious, folks who are honest. Coming from particularly the consulting world, you don't last long if you can't say when you know them something. And so you really, really have to be able to identify what you don't know, and then understand how far you can go to learn as much as you can about it. So curiosity and honesty. And I think also a passion for learning, but not just any type of learning, not just building on that data science skill set, but like I said, learning about the business, learning about how this is influencing decisions. It's as a data owner, it really comes down to owning to some degree, even if it just be thin threads and tendrils, but understanding from where the data is being generated through to your actual role, and then out into the world and how it's being used and how that's going to be a loop. It's going to keep coming back, and you're going to keep going through that cycle of providing recommendation, goes out into the world, data comes back in, revisit, keep going. And I think being able to learn not just about the methods, but also how you are making an impact and being able to own that from beginning to end is very important. Because not only does that give you a good opportunity for growth, but some folks love data, and after 10 years, maybe they want to take a more managerial role. Well, then they can do that, and they already have their feet in strategy. They already have their feet in CapEx or something like that. Maybe folks don't have enough of a footing in data. The more they learn about it, data is the blood of the business. And so it flows through every limb of it. And so I think while making sure that they become some level of knowledgeable or some level of almost like a subject matter expert in some aspect of how the business is working, it ties in very closely to how the data is being applied. So honesty, curiosity, and openness to learning, not just in the skill set, but how their work lives in the wild and how it comes back to them.
And at the very beginning of the podcast, you mentioned about the truth of the data, which kind of it's one big mindset, right? If you're looking for the single version of the truth, you need to be truthful in yourself in on the right side of the brain, right? So, what do you think about the importance of truth? And some of the best ways to facilitate a culture of, let's call it, data truthfulness, not just from a logical perspective, but also from like a wider culture piece.
Yeah. So truth is a fun word, right? Because no matter what, we only know what we know, right? In any case, we only know what we know. I think it's going to be sunny today. It's what the weather says, but sometimes it's just not sunny. And, I think it comes the same way with data, where particularly if you're trying to look for causality, or if you're trying to make a forecast. I think those are the big two areas where you can be confident, but you can't ever be certain. There's no 100%. Even if it can be 99.9 going on forever, but it cannot be 100. And so when it comes to truth, I think people have to understand that the caveats with that go into, I would say, truth, not so much as accuracy, right? Because we are seeking truth, and the job of the data scientist is to understand that truth, to define a single source of truth, to run with it, and to make it be this unambiguous, fully aligned sort of outcome that we're trying to hit, or number or insight that we're trying to see, and ride with that. But I think being able to convey, from a cultural standpoint, the assumptions that have gone into that, from saying what we understand the situation to be. Usually the simpler questions are the hardest to define, right? The simplest question of all is, how are we doing? What should we do? And, how are we doing? A million different areas, segments of the business, different types of data we're looking at, what are we talking about? And the more and more you go down the rabbit hole, the more you have to make assumptions. And if it were a very specific question, let's say, what's the ROI on this particular project, and what do we expect to be 6 months from now? Well, again, how do we want to determine the principle for the investment? Are we looking at just man hours and money? Are we also looking at time? Are we looking at wages outside of a capital investment? How are we defining the foundational base of this entire analysis? And I think a lot of times that's where anytime the analyst has to make an assumption, it needs to be flagged and brought down on paper. It needs to be communicated to the right folks, and make sure that you have alignment the whole way through. I strongly believe in the concept of a single source of truth, where you shouldn't have two versions of the same metric or two versions of the same report that say totally different things. And so that means that every step of the way, from defining the problem to running the analysis to getting the output, you need to have alignment, not just with your team on how you're going to go about it, but also with the folks who you're going to be sharing this with, and saying, all right, how are we defining success? We can't just say revenue goes up by 10%. Give me more here. What are the main drivers? What do we think the main drivers are? Are we confident that that's it? When's the last time we checked? Like, do we think that 10% is going to be a short-term thing or a long-term thing? Like, what is the story we're trying to tell here? What is our narrative? Are we just doing like a checkbox, or are we trying to really, really have a thoughtful sort of analysis here? So I think that when it comes to, that type of discussion, you really, really need to frame your assumptions and just make sure that whatever source of truth or accuracy you are pursuing is as holistic as possible, and that every caveat or potential concern or need for further investigation is flagged. And I think that is what gives people more confidence than just seeing a blind insight shared with a thumbs up. I think it's much better to say, we already have next steps planned, and there's always a way that we can be better.
And just touching on some of the successful skills as well that we've talked about so far, how did these play into your success as a professional during your career? Can you give some examples?
Sure. Let's see. So you mean specifically around just like this level of specificity and
exactly
assumptions? And I think. So I think there's a few ways I can talk about it, but I guess they all lead back to the same point. It was something that I don't think I fully appreciated in the beginning of my career. Right out of college, when I was working, I did view it as, get us this number, get us this insight, pass it along. And, and whatever assumptions needed to be shared, I just kind of had to eyeball it, ballpark it, and just share whatever I thought made the most sense. But, I was 22 years old and, working out of Salem, Massachusetts, and trying to just get a paycheck and work up in my career. And I didn't really think about like the longer term, broader implications of these things. And, while the analysis was fine and good, I think that a lot more value could have been, incorporated if I had, taken more time to have the conversations with my manager and go out of my way to say, what's going to happen after you pass this along. And there's always a little bit of that insight, but that's why it's very important, particularly for managers, to always, always educate their teams and to try to avoid that hierarchical way of thinking when it comes to the learning curve of who you're working with. Like, make sure that they have the same information you do. Whenever I work with my team, regardless of level, I always try to give them the full context of why I'm asking something, even if it's unnecessary, because eventually they'll see a pattern. They'll see a pattern in the types of questions we as a group are constantly trying to answer, and the types of needs that we're trying to serve that they might not always be aware of. So I think it's very, very important to, again, train folks up on how the business works. And if you do that, then incorporating those assumptions and incorporating those caveats and concerns will be much easier. But for myself, it wasn't something that I really learned until maybe my third year of working, in terms of how I really, really needed to sort of tell that full story. I think some folks will tell it within, maybe, between like index and a thumb. And then some people started telling it between maybe, their two hands sort of, stretched out as far as they could. And I'm trying to tell the narrative from wall to wall now. And I think it's realizing that the narrative doesn't really stop. It does go full circle, and understanding that it was less of a line and more of a circle where it goes out and it always comes back. That really helped me frame things, because it was less of a, we need this done, and more of a, I see, this is what's going to happen, and I already know what you're going to ask, and here's what we should do when that happens.
And that's super interesting, because do you have like a system or a specific process when you are looking at taking on a new project or a new idea, a new model, for example, do you have a process of reaching out to key stakeholders to initially begin that relationship? I mean, I imagine at Wayfair as well, because it's quite a new company, there's a lot of new relationships to be built.
Yeah, no, there are. It's a very, very relationship-based company in a very good way, in the sense that everyone knows each other, everyone can approach each other very fluidly and very affably, and just speak very honestly with each other. And I think that's what makes things run so well. With myself, throughout my whole career, and even in this role, there's definitely no hesitancy to reach out to clarify things. Most of the time, just because there is such frequent communication, the context is usually very, very explicit. But in cases where it's not, it is 100% on myself or my team to just make sure that we have the appropriate resource planning with any other stakeholders, any teams we need to partner with, making sure that there's, again, clear understanding of the outcome that we're trying to drive. Because it's one thing if, say, for example, you ask, like a software development team, hey, we need the software done, great, and then just not really saying what it ties into or why we need it, and just kind of making it another task. I avoid that as much as humanly possible. It's really more about pretty much telling the same story with slightly different language to everyone who's involved, because everyone speaks a slightly different language. I speak the language of data. We have folks speak the language of other things in the company. But at the end of the day, it's the same conversation, just translated based on the context of what you do. And so that's what I really try to do is when we do get those types of requests, that we just make sure that the person who's requesting it understands, again, the assumptions going into it, the timeline, and that we can have a clear alignment on what's needed. And then from there, we reach out to stakeholders and we pretty much we frame the conversation based to what we specifically need for them. But in terms of the outcome, it is consistent, clearly communicated. And if there are any concerns, we loop it back up. And then that becomes a bit of a cycle of review and assurance and making sure that everyone's talking to each other. It's less down the line and again, more in that circle.
So how would you contextualize your role at Wayfair now? We can give it a specific job title. I'm kind of more looking for how you see your role to the rest of the business, how the rest of the business sees you.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, I'm in the service vertical. So I work with our service group. So these are the folks who are assisting with customers who are calling in with some sort of a need. So usually it's related to the website or orders or things like that, but making sure that it's very customer facing, and we provide that service for that. And so my role, I would say, in a nutshell, is basically broken out into three different areas. Right, one is ensuring alignment and working with pretty much every vertical in North America and the EU within that service group to make sure that we understand what our goals are. So having actual plans that we want to roll out and how we want to go about that, and the needs, resourcing, and timeline for each of those. Second is targets and making sure that I'm responsible, my team and I, for making, again, that single source of truth and ensuring that everyone knows the same target that they're working with and that there's clear alignment toward goals. And then lastly is kind of a combination of front end, back end, ensuring that the data is being accurate, and that once that data is being published, that we're able to communicate that we're able to have, review sessions with senior leadership, with C-suite, with whoever needs to look at it, and that we can sort of talk with the folks who are owning these different lanes of work and make sure that the clear needs and the clear next steps or concerns are communicated at a pretty regular cadence to make sure that, again, not only senior leadership, but also their teammates and anyone else involved is aware of what's happening.
So Pat, it's been a great interview. I just have a couple more questions for you. You've been in this space for some time now. What made you fall in love with data and analytics?
Sure. I think for me, it was the problem solving basis. I loved the idea of just being able to solve problems. It was the sort of thing where I know a lot of engineers who I've spoken to have a similar view on their careers, where you're pretty much given something where there's no clear outcome and you have to rely on your own skills to be able to resolve it. And, I'm sure a lot of folks who have been in the industry for, 10 years or so or longer, like myself, can agree, like a lot of the coding I did was self-taught. And that's something that I really, really loved, because every day I'd wake up and I'd be learning a new language. I'd be using a different part of my brain. I'd be learning, new approaches to things. And so it was the problem solving, but also the fact that you never really stop learning. The learning curve flattens a bit, but it never fully goes away, and there's no place for complacency in data. So that's what really made me fall in love with it. That and the fact that it coincides with pretty much everything that's happening right now. You can work for a government agency, you can work, for a large tech company, or you could work for an industrial site. And in any case, they'll be needing data folks to jump in and do run those numbers and share some insights.
And what are you most excited about achieving in the new role at Wayfair?
Yeah, I think for myself, I'm most excited about just sort of forging our way forward. Wayfair's come a very long way, and we have a really great group of folks behind us, and we have some really, really skilled minds on our team. And it's going to come down to, really just making sure that I can continue to innovate and my team can find, new ways to ensure that everything stays effective and shipshape. That it's not so much, while a part of it is ensuring that there's clear alignment and making sure that, things are being built up and pushed forward, and that the data that we have underlying is correct and accurate, we also need to think about new channels of data and data collection. We need to think about new initiatives and products and things that we want to roll out that our team can partner on and help push forward. It's there's a huge new frontier, and we're just getting started. But because we are so horizontally integrated into the rest of the service organization, my team is in a very good position to just continue to push things to the right and up, so to speak.
Mm. And what advice would you give for data and analytics leaders today?
I would say just keep your hands on the pulse of the industry and try to tread that gray line wisely between the temptation to adopt new and differentiated ways of doing things that might have a long-term loss of efficacy, compared to finding something that works and works well, that even your competitors, maybe like a more common standard approach that your competitors are also using. But it's not just about the process, it's about how you implement it. So, if company A is doing the same thing as company B in terms of how they're processing their data and keeping standards in place, maybe company B is in a much better position to do something with that information than company A. It's not just about how you look at the data, it's also how you use those insights. It's not just this echo chamber, this black box. It's once you have that information, really think about how you can use it and scale it up. Because there's sometimes temptation that newer is better. And in terms of data, it can go either way. It just comes down to, are you going to take a foundational method or a growth approach? And both have their place. But at the end of the day, it's not about the method, it's about the insights that come from it.
Well, Pat, it's been great to have you on the show. Some really good insights for the data storytellers there, and hope to be in touch again soon.
Likewise. Thanks for having me, Paul.